Sergeant and Mrs. Smith, you're going to love this house.
Is that a tub in the kitchen?
There's no field manual for finding the right home. But when you do, USAA Homeowners Insurance can help protect it the right way. Restrictions apply.
Welcome to Supernatural Circumstances, the podcast where we take you down the rabbit hole into the fantastic world of the strange, the paranormal, and the unknown. I'm Morgan Knudsen.
And I'm Mike Browne. It is time to dim the lights and settle in. Come along with us on this week's adventure. And we're talking to Susan Demeter this week.
Yeah, about a very famous case and yet not really talked about too much, which is the case of Deborah Moffitt and Mr. Entity.
I'm really curious to learn more about this because this is a new case to me. So let's get on with it because I'm really curious.
Oh yeah, there's so much to talk about, and I mean, if any case can be examined and torn apart and has caused controversy, this is it. So let's talk to Susan.
eBay Motors is here for the ride. With over 122 million parts, you can make sure your number one ride or die stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply.
Well, this is a really exciting case, and Susan, we are so glad to have you on this because you're the perfect person to come in and talk about this craziment that went on. So thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be on the show tonight, and this is definitely the type of case that's in my wheelhouse. I'm all about the high strangeness, and this one, like, very strange.
This one's really new to me, so I'm just gonna ride the wave.
Well, this one, it's got so many components to it, and it starts off almost like you'd expect a haunting to start off, but it sure doesn't go that way. So let's get into this a little bit, Susan. First of all, when did this start? And tell us a little bit about the housing situation here, because this is kind of odd. This has to do with 3 houses in a row.
Actually, there's a fourth, but we'll get into that. Okay, so the case starts with a woman by the name of Deborah Moffitt. And I believe she was originally from New York. And she met a man online, or not online, there wasn't online then, but through correspondence and through mutual interests. And they started a long distance relationship. And she ended up moving to California to a place called Rancho Cucamonga. And that's where he was living. And they got married. And so his name, Bill Moffitt, okay, he and his family owned 3 houses on the same street. Actually, I wrote down in the note, it was called Archibald Avenue. I'm sure it's still there. And these 3 houses were side by side. There was one that was occupied by a grandmother, Domenica. Now, she lived in that house before Deborah met Bill Jr., and moved to California. And then the middle house was occupied by Bill Jr. and his 2 parents, Bill Sr. and his mom, Lee. Now, he lived with his parents because he had a heart condition. And he was too nervous to live, even though it was like the next house over, his own house. He was really nervous because of this condition, because it could cause a sudden heart attack. And he was living with his parents at the time. So when Deborah moved to get married to him, they ended up living with the parents, and the other house that belonged to Bill Jr. was rented out. So before Deborah even got there, according to her book and another book that was written, both I believe are now out of print, unfortunately. But according to that book, the grandmother, Domenica, had suffered a stroke. Now, after she had recuperated in hospital for a bit, she went home and they got a caregiver. Now, the caregiver apparently wanted to do some sort of ritual to see if she could help heal Domenica. In part, probably because she was a caring and kind woman, and in part, apparently, she was worried that if she lost this job, she might have to return back to, I think it was Guatemala that she had originally come from, but she was practicing a ritual called Santeria, which is a combination of a West African, Caribbean, it's kind of a Caribbean version of voodoo, but they have another name, like actual practitioners have a name that they prefer. And unfortunately, it's in the heat wave I'm having here. I've lost it off the top of my head what it is, but if you look it up, it's called Santeria. And the ritual she performed was to call in a saint or a good kind of a guardian angel type being to help to heal Dominica. Unfortunately, this didn't work. Dominica eventually passed on. And according to the story of the Moffitts, at one point after Dominica had passed and the caregiver was still, I guess, living in the house for a short while afterwards, something happened within the house that frightened her to such a degree that she called the Moffitts in the middle of the night saying, there's something really bad here, help. They ran out of the house because their houses are like side by side on the same street. So they get up, they go over to see what's happening with the caregiver. And apparently she burst out of the house. She ran out and they say they saw what appeared to be a light ball, which came out of the house and it disappeared. And they were really freaked out. And she was just, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I was trying to do good and something bad really has happened here. And there's now this bad spirit in this house. I can't stay in this house anymore. And she said, you can't go into it either. Especially you, Lee. Now, Lee was the mother of Bill Jr. She was the senior lady in the situation living next door. She said, especially you, whatever is here doesn't like you. You can't go in this house anymore. So this is where the Moffitts say that they feel is the beginning of what turns into a really wild, wild haunting. So this first part happened before Deborah moved from New York City to be with Bill Jr. Now, from there, obviously, they were sympathetic to the caregiver, but you have to go into the house, you have to clean it up, they have to decide whether they're going to sell it or someone else will, rent it or whatever, right? So clearly they went into the house, So and then from there, subtle things started happening. Not in the house where Dominica had passed, but in the middle house, which is where Bill Sr. and Lee and now Deborah and Bill Jr. were living. Just like how things are, they start very subtly. Like, yeah, exactly. Like something is in a certain place and it's moved, or there's a strange little bang or whatever. And it's funny because according to Deborah's book, at first they thought it was really something playful or it was kind of funny. Like there wasn't, for her, she was not scared of this initially. Yeah. So they got Domenica's house sorted out and they rented it to somebody who moved in. And he said soon after he had moved in, he talked to them and he said, I think that, there might be a ghost here. And, I brought in a Ouija board and I was trying to make contact and some strange things were happening in the house. And then so eventually, so he moves. Now, I don't know if he moved because he was experiencing a haunting too, or he just, he was a renter and he moved on. They went, yeah, yeah, it was something like that. So it could have been definitely related to the haunting, but you know how people tend to be shy about these things. They don't, necessarily come forward with, oh, we moved out because of the haunting. But I mean, he was in a position to do that, I guess, easier maybe because he was a renter, but they did end up having a couple move in. And they noted that the couple moved in, they seemed to be very happy at first, but then some things happened where the man in the situation, his personality started changing. And they could hear like arguments and fighting going on. And this isn't, again, in Dominica's house. And they could hear it because they were next door. And then one day, apparently, they noticed that she was no longer, they didn't see her like for a few days. So, they went to do, I guess, a wellness check and, oh, we've noticed that, your girlfriend or your wife is not here. Is she away or whatever? And he's like, well, she's gone, right? And shortly after this, he moves out and they notice that a carpet is missing, amongst other things, from this Dominica's house. Okay, they figured, all right, well, maybe he moved out, he took the carpet, no big deal. But then after that, apparently they had a visit from a man who said that he knew the couple and that she had been found murdered, wrapped up in a carpet. Okay. And it's like, that is just horrifying. Now, according to Deborah's book, they tried to look into this. Now, again, this is pre-internet days, so it's a little bit more difficult, or it was back then, to try and find out information. They didn't know who this person was. He was not police. It wasn't law enforcement who talked to them. This was just some strange person who showed up at Dominica's house next door and saying, oh, I have this information, and her body was found, which is very creepy. But they couldn't find anything to substantiate that. But it was just this part of the string of very strange occurrences that was going on around this.
Yeah, and I read as well, like that during this time period, throughout these three houses, things were beginning to appear on Deborah's little religious altar as well. There was like things manifesting, like apports of objects that they couldn't identify, like just really odd stuff's kind of going on in behind this now bizarre alleged murder.
Yeah.
Seems to have come out of nowhere. So stuff's like picking up in the house as well. And Bill Sr., he didn't, if I'm not mistaken, he didn't want to report it because he had a pretty shady job as well.
Yeah, or it wasn't.
Or he said.
Yeah, I don't think it was Bill Sr. who had this shady job, if I recall correctly, but his wife's father.
Yeah, he worked as a hitman, he said, or something like that. Like, it was really strange. Yeah.
Yeah, involved with the mafia or something. So they didn't want to dig any further into this potential murder or whatever. And yeah, there was definitely the mother, Lee, was very much a religious woman. She was a Roman Catholic and she had her own altar, and very strange things were happening with the altar. For instance, the first thing is that there was a pair of strange, like a man's underwear or something, or undergarments on top of her statue of Jesus. And it didn't belong to anyone in the house. Like, it wasn't Bill Jr.'s, and they had no one else in the house at that point. And then things started getting knocked down. It was just very, very bizarre. Now, in the third house, okay, so this is the house that belonged to Bill Jr., they also had a renter. And at some point, that renter also started having problems, like as far as, these haunting type things, like things being moved around, strange noises or things like that, or apports, or I think that it was Bill Jr. had a collection or something in there of like these kind of bobbleheads or something
sports
like that.
bobbleheads or something like that. Yeah.
Sports bobbleheads, yeah. And they were all, one day they went to go, and he kept them in a locked room, like it wasn't part of like the rental part of the house. And he went and went to check them out, and they had all been turned facing backwards towards him, like all of them. And there was like apparently no way that the renter could have, even if like, why would a renter do this?
Yeah.
So there's all these people now that are witnessing very strange things that are occurring. And at some point, Bill Jr. started taking photographs. And he took multiple photographs that are time stamped. And you can see them on the internet. And they just a really wild stuff. Like the poltergeist stuff really started to manifest itself in a much more frightening way, with furniture being, moved about, and the mattress at one point looking like it had been clawed apart somehow. Like it's very frightening things. And I guess at some point they decided that they would move. Okay.
Yeah, they were done. They were like selling all 3 houses.
Yeah, it was too much. So they ended up selling, and they moved. They bought a much bigger house, also in the same area of California, but it was a much larger house, and they moved in there. And at that point, they noticed after a few weeks, little things started happening again. And at this time, it wasn't like Deborah was, amused, or it's kind of like, oh, this is kind of funny or weird or whatever. Like, they were genuinely frightened at this point, because they figured something from those other houses on Archibald Avenue had followed them,
right?
Whatever it was. So, and at that point, things started getting very ugly and violent in the new house.
And they even heard a burglar alarm going off, and like screaming up on the upper level, which they couldn't account for either. Like, it was really like, yeah, very, very brash, explosive stuff that was going on. It wasn't like where it started out, according to her, that there was a picture frame that was turned to face the wall originally, and then it just escalated into this explosion of stuff going on, which was, I mean, it's so unnerving for anybody going through something like this.
Yeah, well, especially, and when they said that, like during the period when they were in that transitional phase, when they were moving to the new house, they had all sorts of like violent, like it almost felt like an earthquake was happening in the one main house, which was the middle house that they had all been occupying. At that point, it was like there was glass that was like exploding, and there was, it was to a point where they just picked up the last couple of boxes and literally ran out, and hoping that it was, that was the end of it. But no, whatever it was, followed them to this new house, where at this point, they started to try to seek some help in the new house. So they went to different people, not just ghost hunters, but clergy, Wiccans. They went, they contacted Dr. Evelyn Paglini, who was a parapsychologist / occultist, and her advice to them was to try to befriend whatever this was going on here, this being, who, yeah, like she literally was saying, you should befriend this being, you should make it maybe a little space in the house, and they were having none of that. And then it started contacting them. Like, they were getting these messages on the mirrors on soap. Like,
yeah, let's talk about this, because this is where things to me get really, really strange. Like, with this, it goes from psychokinetic stuff moving around the house, and cabinets being ripped off the walls and all sorts of things like this, to actual written messages in English on the bathroom mirror and all
Yes.
sorts of weird things like short phrases like I think talk to me was one, no
Mhm.
escape was one. And then they were getting warnings which almost seemed kind. And then there was another message that would show up that would call them fools, or just
Mhm.
really, really strange messages. But these were actually showing up on the mirror, and there's photos of this.
Yeah. Yeah. And the being then at that point, the entity, um, after they had some shamanic practitioners come in, which tried to force it to reveal itself in the hopes of having it move on. And so it did reveal itself in the sense that it wanted to be called Prince, and
Yeah.
not Prince like the artist Prince, I guess, but but Prince, I'm here, I'm Prince. And it's funny because Deborah refused. She's like, I'm not calling you Prince. You're Mr. Entity.
Yeah.
And at that point, they were referring to this thing as Mr. Entity, who would also leave strange, almost looking like a symbol or sigil of a triangle with like an S shape at the bottom of it.
Yeah, it was
And
like a little tail that kind of came off the bottom. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean,
And
I
there was no
looked at
way of figuring out
yeah.
where it came from. Like when they looked up the symbology of this thing, there was nothing. Like it didn't seem to be a reference to anything. And meanwhile, which was crazy as well, is that the walls and stuff like that were starting to get torn up with what looked like a knife, like these really sharp, jagged gouges into the
Mhm,
wall with the carpets ripped up and whatnot. And it escalated. What I noticed when I was sort of going through this timeline was that it escalated right after they had a priest come in to bless the house, and
mhm,
he just half-assed it. Like he just came in, wouldn't leave the foyer. It was just like, yeah, here's here's your blessing. I gotta go. And the one thing that I've learned over the years with these entities is that if you're going to get into a challenge with them, don't ever lose. And it's like it just becomes this power struggle if you end up losing that initial challenge. And you can see the escalation where it's like, now you have to call me Prince, now you have to go immediately. Just the dominance just starts getting ramped right up with this thing, and it's like
mhm.
it's crazy. So and now you're getting this really strange symbol. What do you make of that?
The symbol for me, like looking at it with like the lenses of an occultist, obviously like the triangle is the symbol for is the alchemical symbol for fire.
Sure.
Okay. And to me, the S shape is definitely like when I looked at it, like head on looking at it, to me, this is a serpent. Okay, so this is a fire serpent. That's my impression looking at it. It might mean something else,
Yeah.
but I actually, I might view it in a very different, being non-Christian lens as being, well, this is a very powerful, fiery friend, maybe.
Hmm.
I'm a little bit more leaning towards the Evelyn Paglini kind of way of, okay, you're here. Well, here's the boundaries. This is my home, and taking more charge of the situation, which
Yeah.
I think Deborah was doing because
Yeah.
she's like, I know you're not, and later down the road, as this is all escalating and the entity starts revealing why it's there, she's literally coming out and saying, that eventually like this whole thing lasted 6 years. So by the time it was getting more to that end stage of the haunting, she already had two children in the house.
Jeez.
They were babies, okay. But she was like, "You're not going to do anything to my children." And it said, "No, I won't. I will not hurt your children." Which I also found interesting because at that point it's like, I'm Mama Bear here. Like you're here, you're doing all this. You're not going to hurt my kids. And it listened,
Yeah, and
apparently.
there was investigators that came in at that point that as well that sort of repeated Juanita, the caretaker, her analogy or her assessment of it, which was that this was some sort of an ancient energy of some sort. And so I thought that was interesting that now, you've got somebody else coming in and sort of saying the same thing, and that there seems to be some sort of slight respect or respondents to Deborah putting her foot down, and unfortunately the rest of the family, because they weren't on the same page here, the thing's still causing chaos, but it was at least responding in some sort of a good sense and a conscious sense to Deborah, which is huge. That's at this point, if this thing is going to be causing this level of havoc, at least now you're starting to shift the power balance a little bit. But now Lee started to get targeted, and she was getting knives and objects like jammed through chairs at her, and all sorts of the craziest one that came up for me, which I thought was so interesting, which is hard to get around, I think, for people that are listening to this thinking, well, somebody's just throwing things or whatever, was that the one incident where Lee was sitting in the chair at the table and she felt something sharp on the underside of her leg. And when she lifted her leg off the chair, there was a kitchen knife that was jammed up through the bottom of the chair into her leg. Yeah, like it was trying to jam this thing up through the seat of the chair. So it's like just wild, but it started to turn to Lee, and then there was infestations as well.
Yeah, it had a story that it claimed that it was some sort of demonic entity from the seven princes of hell. Like it really put itself up there in the hierarchy of that pantheon of hellish beings. And it said that it's in a 15th or 16th century French monastery. These monks were doing satanic rituals, and that Lee was a nun, or her soul had been a nun, and that they were going to do a blood sacrifice of her. But one of these monks helped her to escape, and she went on to live her life and then eventually reincarnated into Lee. And now it was here, it said, because it wanted to kill Lee. Like one of the messages it wrote in soap is "Die, Lee," or, Lee must die. And I mean, that's just a horrifying. But this was its story, right? To me, it sounds a bit like, I would be suspect of this entity telling me.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, these things
Yeah.
lie through their teeth. Yeah, for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time when people hear some of these stories, because we actually had a case here in Edmonton where one of these things put on the sort of a bluff of a victim that had fallen out of a window and just wanted to come back to see its building again because it had been working on the building. I mean, these things will go through a whole narrative, and usually what's interesting just for the everybody listening is that they usually pull information that's within the space itself. There's usually some sort of connection to the space. Like they have trouble coming up with anything new. So it's interesting to me that it starts pulling on this idea of this sort of ritual, monk type setting where we had, a caretaker early on that was very much into like the old religions and things like that. So you can kind of see this thing pulling this story and putting on this and posturing, putting on this bluff of look how big I am compared to you. So it's really, really interesting story it comes up with.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that Lee is Catholic and very religious, I think plays into that storyline as well.
Definitely.
So at this point, her husband, Bill Sr., started behaving very strangely, very oddly. Deborah had noticed that he would sneak around in the middle of the night and go into the bathroom, and then she would see like the smudged soap on the mirror, as if he was himself trying to communicate one-on-one with this entity. And he began occasionally taking on what these appearances of like a wolf-like being, as if he had been possessed by a wolf, and he would start howling. I think some of the occultists that had come in had said that Bill Sr. was somehow bringing in this entity or keeping this entity around. And at that time, Lee just didn't want to believe it.
I
So
had
they
a
had all these
case like
people.
this, yeah.
Yeah, so they had all these people that had come in, and then at one point she was in a bookshop and she found a book. I think it had just recently had come out because this case was like in the late 80s, early 90s is the time frame when this was happening. And there was a book that came out called The Demonologists, which was about Ed and Lorraine Warren. And so she contacted them. And they did come to the house and they did perform a ritual, which is not, I don't think it's a church ritual, but it's a ritual that they devised to try and
Right.
piss off a demon or whatever, get the demon to reveal itself so that they could know what they're dealing with. And they did this ritual, and Bill immediately became very agitated and threatening, and he threatened the Warrens and again taking on this almost guise of a wolf, like he was howling and snarling and that kind of thing, very frightening. So the Warrens then got a priest involved, and they were going to do an exorcism on Bill without him knowing. But he refused to let the priest in. So the Warrens, they really couldn't do anything at that point because, yeah, because he wouldn't allow it. And I've seen comments online because this case is really polarizing online. Like it's really divided the internet.
For sure. And we can talk about that too after the story because that's another factor in this.
Exactly. So, but the Warrens couldn't do anything at that point because, they brought this priest and Bill was saying, no, you can't enter my home. So there was nothing to do with that. Now, at that point, Lee was able to convince Bill Sr. that he might need, some help from a psychiatric point of view. So he did actually sign himself into a hospital, and he, stayed there, I think, for a few days or whatever. But after his stay there, now, according to Deborah, they accused Lee of perpetrating hoaxes on her husband.
Yeah.
Like they were saying, you need some therapy here as well, because we believe that you are doing this to your husband. You're terrorizing him with these stories, because apparently he came out with the whole story of Mr. Entity and what was happening in the house. And they accused Lee, according to the story. And this just caused so many problems between them that they eventually split up. And Bill moved out of that house. So at that point, I think some of the tension within the house and Mr. Entity started lessening, but it was still ongoing. Now they had a parapsychologist. Now he came twice, like I think 2 or 3 times into the house. The first time he came in, the entity really didn't like him, and apparently sitting there at the table in front of them all, his hair, they heard the sound of what sounded like scissors, with like invisible scissors, and his hair, chunks of his hair started falling out. And it was just like he was so frightened that he left. Now he did come back at one point, and again the entity was being very vicious with him, and calling him all sorts of names, saying that like he had a small, intimate bits there. So I don't know how much I can say on the podcast, but
oh, we go there.
Oh, okay. Well, the entity was saying, like, Gary, this is apparently his name, he's got a small penis. He can't, he's not good in bed or whatever. I don't know, stuff like this. So this is horrifying, obviously, for Gary. But finally, Gary comes back a third time. Apparently, he was in between places to live, and he was still very interested in this entity. And he was moving away to England. And he said, look, maybe this entity, if it's really a prince of hell, can help me out. in my career, in my life, I'm willing to kind of sign my soul over to this entity. The entity would have nothing to do with it. It was insulting him. It was saying, I don't want to hang out with this loser. No. But Deborah really, really put her foot down and said, I don't want you here anymore. You're frightening us. You're bad for my husband's health. Because remember, poor Bill Jr. had a heart condition through all this. And finally, one morning, the entity just wrote, okay, I'll go, goodbye, my family. And off it went.
Yeah. And there was an incident too that I just want to mention also when Bill Sr. was still there, which is really wild, where he said the family woke up to a 16-inch spearhead from nowhere.
Yeah.
And that was super bizarre because they actually he woke up, he felt this thing like at his feet, kind of this Godfather moment of the horse head in the bed, pulls the blankets back, and what's there but this old spearhead, which they ended up taking it to a museum. The writing on the bathroom mirror at that point was, you're going to kill Lee with this spearhead. They took it to the museum, and the damn thing was from the Congo. It was 200 years old, but it looked like it was brand new, And they said, this is super weird. So anyway, so that thing I assume is sitting in a museum somewhere in California.
Yeah, that's just another thing that I forgot, because this case is so wild. It takes so many twists and turns, but the apports, that to me is just incredible. And and apparently the entity had said that, this is the method that I want this Lee to be sacrificed to me, right? And well, no, that's just horrifying.
Yeah, just this whole case is so fascinating. And there's, like you were saying originally, is that this really has divided the internet a lot.
Yes.
People have been arguing like crazy over this. What are the two sides of the argument? What are people fighting about?
Well, I think it's whether people in general, they're picking apart the story. There are a lot of people that are doubting it, saying that they feel that the story is made up, particularly now that the story itself has been picked up by Blumhouse. They're going to be making a horror film out of it.
Of course,
I mean, or a series of kind of Netflix type, but I think that it's going to be made. It was in I think it was Variety and the Hollywood Report or something said that Blumhouse had picked up the rights to this story and the rights to a book, that there's another book, a third one that will come out, that is written by their daughter Jessica. Now, she wrote an opinion piece on all of this in 2022, which is really heartfelt. And in there, that's how this kind of went viral, is people sharing it and saying either they're supportive and they believe this family, or they're not supportive at all and they're picking apart, or they're cherry picking pieces. Like some people will say, oh, well, the fact that the Warrens were there means that it can't be true. Or the fact that the Warrens were there and were able, and they refused their help, that means it can't be true. See, no matter what with the Warrens, and I know they're controversial, but just because the Warrens were there, you can't win, apparently, which is really not fair. No. And then like I said, there are people more like myself who, I mean, I've been looking at cases like this. I've followed up cases like this in Ontario. And I believe them. I mean, there are things that probably, like, all of these types of cases are messy, okay? Like they're not perfect. There are things that might go on. There even may be some trickery that might go on in parts of this. It's impossible to pick through and pick apart. But I've listened to the interviews with Deborah Moffitt, and I do believe she is very sincere, and I feel this family was extremely traumatized. And some of the arguments that people are making against the story, well, if you really immerse yourself into poltergeists and into these cases, and cases where people believe they're dealing with demons or, evil entities or whatever you want to call it, there are things that make sense about this, including the way it ends with the goodbye, my family.
Yeah.
Okay. Like it's, you know, it to some people, they're like, well, this is very anticlimactic. Would this prince of hell literally go away? But who's to say it's a prince of hell?
Yeah. Well, and that typically is what happens, you know, like
Yeah.
people are expecting, we saw this in the case of the Pauper's Ghost too, where everybody's thinking there's going to be this great big climatic thing like in the movies, and that's just not what happens. It usually starts and stops and it stops as quick as it starts. That's usually how this stuff plays out. Like it's really wild. Mike, what do you think about all this?
Oh, my, I'm just like blown away by the violence of this thing. You know, like, I'm not big on hearing the name Ed and Lorraine either. I'm just one of those guys. When I hear they're involved, my eyes roll and I can't help it. But it doesn't give me pause about the story itself. It's just their involvement that bothers me. So, but yeah, this whole thing, like the word demon, really sort of drives me around the bend a little bit. But Morgan and I talk a lot about consciousness, and it's about what the consciousness is of the people who are having these things happen to them. Tend to color the events it's themselves, if that makes any sense.
Oh, it does. And I think that when you're looking at the consciousness aspect, it really does play into people's cultural beliefs, their place and point in time, and how they feel about this. And especially with these poltergeists, you can kind of look at like different areas of the world and how people experience them can be very different.
Right.
And even if if you strip apart all the mythology and cultural aspects of it, it seems to be a similar, same kind of experience.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
Like with
Yeah.
and that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard
but
to parse out that like the personal biases that are always sort of inherent in these stories, because the storyteller has a history of, you know, religion, belief, all those kind of things. So, yeah, but yeah, I love talking about like what the root of it, like what is this thing, what's at the root of this story, and to me, this one is actually pretty scary.
It is. There is a case that is similar to it that it was investigated, and it was happening around the same time frame in England, in Hertfordshire. Now, the couple involved were not religious, but it kind of took the same route and very similar things in that they had apports. The entity was asserting itself as very powerful. Like when they told it to go away, they were, I was here before you, I'm going nowhere kind of thing. It was also leaving messages, but with pen. Okay. So for instance, the husband in this situation, he really liked crosswords. So he'd be doing a crossword and then he'd wake up in the morning and it'd be like finished. Or there would be notes like, you know, ha ha, kind of taunting him. And this case was widely investigated by ASAP, so the Association of Scientific Study of Paranormal Phenomena in England. And they also, this couple went to the church, and the church really couldn't do much for them. They said, you know, we don't think you have a ghost here, but the best thing you can do is to return to the church. And they didn't. But there's very similar aspects to this case as well, in that I had forgotten to mention in the Moffitt case that the entity was literally like taking bites out of their food. Like they would have food, they put it on the counter, and then there'd be like bite marks in it. And this was also happening in this case in England, where this lady would have chocolate bars that she would take with her to work in the morning, and she'd noticed either her chocolate bars were missing or they were half bitten. There were threats made against these people, and now eventually, whatever it was, unfortunately in this case, the wife passed away of cancer, And at her passing, she also saw this entity as a shadow person in the hospital. But at her passing, the poltergeist activity stopped in the house. And that was another thing too with the Moffitts that, at one point, Lee, who seemed to be the victim or the person that was being picked on by this entity, ended up in hospital. And it told Deborah, and through the mirror with the soap writing on it, that Lee is going to die. Lee will die in 10 days. Well, Lee didn't die, but she did describe in hospital seeing this dark, shadowy thing on the ceiling that would kind of morph into what looked like a humanoid being beside her bed. But then she also said that at that point, she saw this beautiful golden white light appear that to her was her mother that had passed on. And her mother was there at the hospital saying, no, you're not doing your thing. And that whatever the shadow, which I guess was assumed to be Mr. Entity, kind of dissipated. But I thought that portion of the story was actually really beautiful, because I feel that way too. Like I sometimes I do in my own studies become a little nervous about certain things that I might be bumping into, but I feel, because both of my parents are on the other side, that they're part of my ancestors, they're part of my spirit guides. And so I have powerful, beings on the other side that are there with me too. So I thought that part of the Moffat story was really beautiful.
It
But
is. It's stunning, and I think you bring up such a really good point, because uh, many people hear cases like this and they think, oh my God, I would never ever touch the paranormal. I'd never, this is the nightmare of all nightmares, which it kind of is. But there's I think what people don't realize is that in order to end up in situations that are similar to this, you have to be resonating with these. There's a resonance going on within either the family dynamic or something that stuff starts. I mean, we talked about this in Paramook a number of times, and whatnot. And I think that's really the key here, is that dynamics like this can be shifted, but it really does start with taking a look at the social dynamics of the family and yourself. Like what is this incident that's occurring around me telling me about what I got to clean up? And and I think that's the amazing thing about that incident in the hospital with Lee, was the fact that she had just let go enough of the resistance that she had. She's kind of in and out of consciousness, she was saying, and she just let go of that resistance enough, and all of a sudden she sees her mom.
yes.
And I think it's so significant, that moment of like, what just as a macrocosm of things that we see in general in parapsychology, is that when you let go enough and you're just, you kind of go with the flow, so to speak, this amazing side of this comes out and starts happening. And that's really what we can all line up with. Like anybody that's in a negative situation like that, you can start to line up with the other side of this, which is, the loved ones that you've lost, and the people who have, passed over, and this incredible sort of source energy that you can interconnect with, which is part of us.
Yes, 100%. And when you do that, it's so empowering. And when people are empowered, it's at that point where I think these things sort of, they either dissipate or they weakened, and then eventually they stop. Because these types of violent hauntings, like in the case of the Moffitts, it was 6 years. That's quite a long time. Usually they don't last more than a few months, where you have this beginning of what seems like maybe, oh, that's interesting or that's weird, to this really violent haunting, to then it goes away.
Yeah.
In their case, it was much, much longer. And there are other cases too, which are much longer. But I think that, if you can embrace that side and empower yourself, then you're in a much better position, and these things do tend to go away. I
Yeah.
think the power is within us, really.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, we are the ones that shape our reality. And Mike, I mean, you and I, we talk about this all the time, is that all the time, which is it always comes back to us. And it's like, what are we doing or not healing, or like, what do we have going on that can shift this? Well, Susan, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for going down the rabbit hole with us about this
Well,
case.
thank you for having me. I really enjoyed our time discussing it. I could talk about this stuff for hours.
Oh, gosh, so could we. Well, we'll absolutely have you back so we can talk some more and whatnot. Where can people find you and your work and your incredible Facebook group? Because I think people should all go and join that.
Oh, thank you. Well, there's susandemeter.com is my main like hub online. And from there you can find my different socials. I am on Facebook, on X, the former Twitter, yeah, Instagram that you can find me there as Cosmic Witch. But Susan Demeter, if you just find me easily that way. And yeah, I'll put a link up to the group. Now the group is private, but it is paranormal studies and intuition. If you want to try and find that on Facebook. I've set it to private because I found that a lot of people, like there's a lot of Canadians on there. And I find that, especially in Canada, a lot of people, they prefer privately to discuss.
It's
I
super
think,
true. Yep.
yeah. But it is there. So, and you can find the group there and you can find me. And I love talking about this stuff. And if you've had an experience and you need a sympathetic, non-judgmental ear, I'm here. I am happy to talk to people and empower them if I can.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much. And we will, as I say, we will have you back and we'll talk about this a bit more. So thanks, Susan.
Okay, 100%. Thank you both so much.
Thank you. Wow. I don't know what to say after that one. Wow. That was really interesting.
It's a wild, wild case, and you can see why this has stirred up so much controversy on the internet. People going back and trying to figure out what exactly happened here. Why are there weird messages appearing on these mirrors? What is going on? What is the dynamic here that's going on? And what I found really interesting with this case specifically is that when I wrote my book, Teaching the Living, this is the type of case that Stephanie, my business partner, and I at the time really got our focus onto, because these types of cases, you can start to examine what the behavior is, not only of the entity involved, but the behavior of the people. And it was like Susan was mentioning during our chat here, is the idea that when we can take the labels off of what's going on, it really does come down to the dynamic that we get going between us and the entity and whatnot that's in the home. And this is such a really great example of how one kind of ends up feeding the other. And you can end up with some pretty, not only strange phenomena, but something that can last for a lot of years.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, this is such an interesting case that Jessica Moffitt, who was involved, also has written a book about it called Mr. Entity, The Moffitt Family Haunting. And it's not out yet. She's just finished the manuscript, but looks like Blumhouse is already interested and want to make a movie too.
Well, I can't blame them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like they're going to be missing content. I think these types of cases for me are what really brought me into the paranormal to begin with when I was younger, because I've always had a really big fascination as to why, whether they be people or whether they be entities, why they do what they do and how do they do it. And it was cases like this that really sort of sucked me into the psychology behind the paranormal. And when Steph and I were starting out, and we were studying the behaviors of some of these things, we classified them into a few different categories, not the type of entity because we don't know even what they are.
Right.
But looking at the behavior, we looked at ones that we called the immediate aggressor, the wolf in sheep's clothing, and then we had ones that we kind of nicknamed the pit bull because they seem to be very territorial.
Mm-hmm.
And this one is just a screaming example of what we talked about in Teaching the Living, which is the immediate aggressor, where there's no false identity, there's no bluff identity, they don't hide what they are. It's just 1 second your house seems okay, and then the next second your house is being, cabinets are being ripped off the walls, and it's terror. And these cases are relatively rare. You don't see a lot of these, but when they come up, they're really violent and they're quite frightening, and they're really frightening for anybody that's involved in them.
Well, this is a case that I'm definitely going to dig into more.
Oh, absolutely. And Susan's she was the perfect person to have on for this. I'm so glad that we got such a fantastic breakdown, and we'll leave her information in the show notes here, and people can take a look. But there's a lot of information out there to sort through, whether you're on the side that this was real, or you think this is being hoaxed somehow, or whichever. This is a rabbit hole you want to go down. It's really interesting.
It is. So thank you, dear listeners, for joining us on this eerie expedition.
And remember, there is no line between the natural and the supernatural. All is consciousness, guys. Until next time, stay curious, friends.
Supernatural Circumstances is a co-production of Entity Seeker Paranormal Research and Teachings and Good Egg Studios. This podcast is part of the Curious Cast podcast network. Theme music by Corey Johnson of Catalyst Records in Edmonton, Alberta. You can learn more about Morgan Knudsen at entityseeker.ca and learn more about me, Mike Browne, and listen to my show, Dark Poutine, at darkpoutine.com. Feel free to email the show at supernaturalcircumstances@gmail.com.
On a night cold enough to freeze your bones, a prospector searching for a legendary cursed gold mine vanishes without a trace. I'm Crew Williams, the host of Dead Man's Curse. This season, we retrace the steps of fortune seekers looking for a mother lode worth billions who never came back. So come join our quest. Search for and follow Dead Man's Curse Volcanic Gold on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts.